Welcome to The Explainer. So glad you could make it. All right, let's just dive right into this, shall we? Today, we're looking at one of the most sobering, intensely studied periods in all of human history. We're going to objectively analyze the very specific historical, economic, and psychological factors that fueled the rise of a devastating regime in Germany. We're unpacking the historical records and the hard data directly so we can really understand the nuts and bolts behind this perfect, yet absolutely terrifying storm. We'll see exactly how an entire nation was captivated by a fatal attraction.
And here is the core question we absolutely have to answer today. How did a shattered nation, completely broken and stripped of its pride after the First World War, turn into a terrifying military powerhouse in just 11 years? I mean, the 1930s saw a total, radical transformation of the German state. So to wrap our heads around how millions were taken in by this fatal attraction that ultimately led to global catastrophe, we've got to look at the exact steps and the deep psychological manipulation that actually made it possible.
Section 1. The Pride and the Fall.
So to truly grasp the absolute depths of Germany's despair in the 1920s, we really have to look back at the immense pride they held just a few short years prior. Back in the late 19th century, Germany was powering ahead economically, right? They literally overtook Britain as an industrial power. They were highly militarized, extremely prosperous, and incredibly ambitious. Then, when World War I broke out in 1914, they suddenly found themselves fighting a devastating two-front war. But by March 1918, that dreaded two-front war actually seemed to be over when they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia. Meanwhile, the German public was being fed this highly optimistic propaganda by their military leaders, leaving them absolutely convinced that total victory was just around the corner. So you can imagine, when the armistice was suddenly signed in November 1918 after America entered the conflict, the German people were utterly blindsided. They had zero expectation of defeat. That psychological shock, it was profoundly disorienting.
Section 2. And nobody finds a purpose. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is the shift from the macro-level trauma of the nation to the micro-level origins of Adolf Hitler. We find a stark, undeniable contrast between myth and reality. The regime later painted Hitler as this struggling, politically awakened artist who was practically torn from his easel by his profound love for Germany. But the historical reality? It's completely different. He was actually a bit of an aimless drifter in Vienna. He was living on a generous allowance from his mother. He was rightly rejected from art school. And ironically enough, historical records show his early associations with Jewish people were entirely benevolent. The beloved family doctor who treated his dying mother? Jewish. The art dealer who sold his amateurish paintings just to keep him afloat? Also Jewish. He absorbed this bizarre mishmash of radical anti-Semitic ideas from Vienna's cafe society, but his actual early life was a far cry from the heroic mythology he constructed later on.
As the saying goes, the First World War turned a nobody into a somebody. The Second War broke out. Hitler eagerly signed up for the German army. For him, the military provided this rigid structure and a sense of purpose he just desperately craved. He served as a battalion runner and actually showed undeniable courage, surviving from start to finish and even earning the Iron Cross First Class. And remarkably, that medal was awarded on the direct recommendation of a Jewish superior officer. Still, he remained a corporal. Reports suggest he was kind of a loner, an eccentric guy who completely lacked the true leadership qualities needed for a promotion. But for the first time, the war gave him a purpose he never managed to find in civilian life.
Section 3. The Stab in the Back. Okay, so here is exactly where the massive national tragedy and those individual resentments violently converge. The absolute crucial point here is understanding the Treaty of Versailles, and specifically Article 231, which is also known as the War Guilt Clause. This strict provision literally forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the entire war. Now, for a nation that genuinely believed they were fighting a defensive war against encirclement, this was an absolute outrage. It deeply degraded their honor and saddled the country with massive, crippling financial reparations that they were expected to pay to the victorious Allies for decades to come.
Because the German public simply couldn't mentally process this sudden, totally unexpected defeat, they desperately needed a scapegoat. Enter the stab-in-the-back myth. This was a completely baseless conspiracy theory, claiming that the glorious German army wasn't actually defeated on the battlefield, but was instead betrayed on the home front by left-wing politicians and Jewish populations. Initially, this was very much a lunatic fringe belief on the far right, but psychologically, it provided a dangerous, easy answer. It was basically a form of mass denial for a humiliated population that was desperate to explain away a devastating loss.
100,000. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the mighty German military was severely restricted to just 100,000 men. And keep in mind, that included cooks and pen pushers, not just frontline fighting men.
They had to completely surrender their combat aircraft, and they weren't allowed to build combat ships. For an intensely proud, heavily militarized nation whose entire core identity was wrapped up in its armed forces, this restriction was seen as a devastating, emasculating blow that just further fractured their national psyche.
Section 4. Birth of a new extremism. So the Weimar Republic is established in 1919 amidst this massive post-war turmoil, right? And extreme fringe groups begin to pop up everywhere. As Hitler realized his unique talent for incendiary public speaking, he started gathering a loyal, intelligent, and frankly brutal inner circle to build the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Let's look at the lineup. You've got Rudolf Hess, a frustrated radical who was totally transfixed by Hitler's rhetoric. Hermann Göring, an amazingly glamorous World War I fighter pilot who brought some much-needed military clout. Then there's Heinrich Himmler, an eccentric, frustrated patriot who was just too young to fight in the war. Martin Bormann, the sinister Machiavellian manipulator, and Joseph Goebbels, a highly educated romantic nationalist with a doctorate and a supreme ability to ruthlessly organize propaganda. Every single one of these men brought a specific, potent resentment or a specialized skill that really fueled the party's dangerous rise.
And the party employed terrifyingly effective visual psychology to literally mesmerize the population. Hitler personally took a very active role in designing the party's flag. He took the swastika, which was originally an ancient Buddhist symbol of the sun, and he applied the old imperial colors of red, black, and white to boldly contrast against the Democratic Republic's colors. He rotated the symbol to give it this vibrating sense of dynamism, placed it just slightly off-center, and surrounded it with a massive amount of red to appeal directly to socialist aesthetics. Historical records note that this was a masterful, albeit deeply sinister piece of graphic design. It was engineered to evoke a visceral energy and psychologically dominate anyone looking at it.
Section 5. The Putsch and the Pen.
The early 1920s in Germany were, in a word, chaotic. We're talking extreme economic distress, fueling direct, violent action right on the streets. In October 1922, Mussolini successfully marched on Rome, which was a huge inspiration to the extreme fringes in Germany. By 1923, the nation was suffering from crushing hyperinflation, and the French had occupied the industrial Ruhr region. So, seizing on this societal breakdown, Hitler and about 600 stormtroopers attempted a really bold coup in November 1923, which became known as the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. It was a complete and utter military failure. The police opened fire, and Hitler was promptly arrested. But the high-profile treason trial that followed in February 1924, it gave him exactly what he needed: a massive national platform to broadcast his extremism.
Following that trial, Hitler was sentenced to just 5 years, and he actually served less than 1 in a surprisingly comfortable prison. While he was in there, he wrote a book, and funnily enough, its original, incredibly uncatchy title was My 4.5-Year Struggle Against Lies, Stupidity, and Cowardice. His publisher smartly shortened it to Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. But what's really crucial here is that during this enforced confinement, Hitler completely internalized his dangerous messiah complex. He laid out his entire twisted worldview, particularly his dark theories on propaganda and mass manipulation, right there in the text for anyone to see.
Section 6. The Crash That Changed Everything. So by the late 1920s, Germany entered what historians now call the False Dawn. By 1928, the Weimar Republic was actually recovering. Thanks to heavy American investment and loans like the Dawes Plan, the currency finally stabilized. Unemployment was dropping rapidly, a genuine sense of optimism was rippling through the nation, and the extreme fringe groups, they were basically fading into irrelevance. The National Socialists could very well have been completely banished to the history books right then and there.
But then came the 1929 Wall Street crash. The American economy completely collapsed, abruptly pulling the rug right out from under Germany's fragile recovery. 7 million German men became unemployed as a direct result of the Great Depression. This sudden, violent plunge back into absolute despair created a vast, desperate audience. Because once a worker was standing in a dole queue with absolutely no hope of feeding his family, he became highly susceptible to radicalization. It provided the absolute perfect psychological conditions for a manipulative regime to swoop in and seize total power.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. But it leaves us with a really chilling question. What terror would be unleashed before the dramatic toppling of this evil regime? By understanding these step-by-step historical and psychological shifts, we can clearly see how a fractured, economically desperate society can be fatally drawn toward extremism. It is a sobering reminder of how vulnerable literally any society can become to radicalization when hope is completely lost. So keep asking questions, keep studying history, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.